Good afternoon from Washington. I'm still reporting on the economy. Another 500,000 Americans hit the unemployment lines again this week. And guess what? The figures the government put out last week, where they claimed to have saved or created 650,000 jobs, have proven to be completely bogus by the alert media.
They keep saying we've created 1 million jobs or saved 1 million jobs. So the standard has changed. We haven't created anything. So when I grew up, that was called, let's see, lying.
Not in Washington. In Washington, it's just called intelligent misleading.
On another front, J.P. Morgan Chase announced this week that it would be doing its patriotic duty to provide jobs for struggling Americans. Morgan announced that they would be hiring 1,200 new mortgage loan officers to bolster up the economy. So what's going on here? Morgan isn't trying to do us a favor. They are desperately trying to reinflate the real estate bubble, and the government, through Freddie and Fannie, is going to back them up. This is reminiscent of a similar scheme when Morgan created the 1907 bank panic, but we'll get to that in a minute. According to the latest numbers from the Treasury Department, J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs are holding the bag on an astonishing $120 trillion worth of the world's most risky debts, called derivatives contracts. Morgan holds a staggering $80 trillion in derivative exposure, 50 times more than their $1.6 trillion in assets. Goldman Sachs is in even more precarious condition. They hold $40 trillion in derivatives, 333 times more than their $120 billion in assets. To put these numbers into perspective, the gross domestic product of the United States is a mere $14 trillion. Even the world gross domestic product is only $65 trillion, and the best estimate of the worth of everything in the world is only $200 trillion. That's how big these numbers are. But instead of being held responsible for the collapse of the world economy, Morgan and Goldman were rewarded during the debacle by being allowed to absorb their primary competitors. Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan really have emerged as the winners, as the last survivors. J.P. Morgan was the biggest winner in the government bailouts. After receiving a $25 billion loan, they gobbled up Bear Stearns' assets for about 2 cents on the dollar. And then the assets of Washington Mutual, the nation's largest bank failure to date, for less than a penny on the dollar. Goldman Sachs received approximately $50 billion in government loans, but both firms have now repaid the government. In the last 3 months, both Morgan and Goldman have reported record corporate profits and are averaging above $1 billion a month profit each. This is not incentive-driven capitalism. This is nothing but out-and-out plutocracy. Big banks controlling the government so that it can no longer do the will of the people. It gives these huge financial monopolies whatever they want. People sense it. They just can't put their finger on the center of the problem. Mega investor Wayne Rogers was certainly not shy about identifying the problem earlier this weekend.
Goldman Sachs is a conspiracy with the government. They're a fascist organization. They're supplying, the guy who's the Secretary of the Treasury. Then he goes back to Goldman Sachs. Meantime, he owns 800,000 shares of Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs gets bailed out by the government, then turns around and pays AIG $16 billion, which is so that they can pay themselves back. It's outrageous. The whole thing is outrageous.
However, this is not the first time that J.P. Morgan has benefited from a financial disaster, one which they may well have helped create. In 1896, J.P. Morgan financed William McKinley, the gold money candidate for president, in his run against William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was attempting to take back the money power from the bankers' gold-only money system and break the 30-year-long post-Civil War depression. Congress had outlawed silver money, so money was scarce and the bankers controlled it all. In reality, whenever the creation of money is left in private hands, mischief always ensues. It's like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. In 1896, Bryan addressed this point exactly in his famous Cross of Gold speech.
Those who are opposed to this proposition tell us that the issue of paper money is a function of the bank, and that the government ought to go out of the banking business. I stand with Jefferson rather than with them, and tell them, as he did, that the issue of money is a function of the government, and that the banks should go out of the governing business.
There you have it, the very definition of the word plutocracy. McKinley easily defeated Bryan in the 1896 election and then again in 1900. After McKinley's assassination in 1901, Teddy Roosevelt became president and won re-election on his own in 1904. But then TR turned against the money trusts and attacked their monopolies. By 1907, Morgan decided to show Roosevelt just who was boss. He spread rumors that one of his chief rivals, the Heinz banks, were in trouble. Depositors flooded the Heinz banks trying to extract their cash. On top of that, Morgan called in all of his loans and refused to issue new ones. Within days, a money panic engulfed all of America. Thousands of banks were vastly overextended, holding less than 1% reserves, just like today. Many simply closed their doors forever. Money was hoarded by anyone who happened to get some. Money simply vanished from the American scene. Many businesses began printing IOUs as a temporary medium of exchange, just like the state of California did earlier this year. Now, the correct solution would have been for the government to come to the rescue and issue its own money without debt to relieve the panic. Then, after confidence had been restored, tax it back out of existence. But that would have defeated Morgan's plans. Morgan then offered to save the last Heinz bank if it would sell him their valuable steel company for a small fraction of its worth. Morgan had recently purchased U.S. Steel from Andrew Carnegie and wanted to eliminate all competition. Although the deal was in direct violation of U.S. antitrust laws, guess what? A desperate Congress approved it. Then Morgan asked Congress to allow him to print up $200 million of his own personal money with no backing whatsoever, Morgan banknotes. Again, a compliant Congress approved. Morgan then sent this new money out to his banks to be lent into circulation at interest, of course. I know it's hard to believe, but this is exactly what the Federal Reserve System allows national banks to do each and every day under our current system. Soon, people regained confidence in money in general, and by 1908, the panic was over, and Morgan was hailed as a hero for saving the nation from the very crisis he had deliberately created. But one inventive Quaker woman named Elizabeth Maggie Phillips saw through the deception. In fact, she invented the game that would become what we call monopoly to illustrate the negative aspects of concentrating real estate holdings into the hands of private monopolies. But Woodrow Wilson, then president of Princeton University, was apparently not as astute. He applauded Morgan's efforts. All this trouble could have been averted if we appointed a committee of 6 or 7 public-spirited men like J.P. Morgan to handle the affairs of our country. Do you see any similarities between 1907 and today? The question is not what backs the money, it's who controls its quantity. But the big banks are always going to be in the governing business as long as our government borrows money from them. Good afternoon.